Welcome everyone, bienvenue. Welcome to this gathering of the heritage sector on unpacking the heritage reset, les tenants et les aboutissants de la relance du patrimoine. My name is Natalie Bill. I'm Executive Director of the National Trust. Happy to be welcoming you all in. So while you're joining the session, feel free to use the chat function to tell us who you are, where you're participating from today, or the heritage place or organization that you're connected to. And our goal is to have a participatory meeting with everybody, anyone who's willing to have their face seen on the screen, and you're welcome to join the conversation as we get going. These gatherings are opportunities just to bring everyone together for informal discussion. And today's topic about the Heritage Reset is really to share the status of this really exciting undertaking that many of you heard the beginnings of at our conference earlier in the fall. And so we want to share with you what's been happening so far and what the next steps are, because we definitely need full participation of the sector as we move into phase 2 of this project. As we get started, I want to first acknowledge that National Trust headquarters is located in Ottawa on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples. And I'm actually participating today from the unceded territory of the Wolastoqey people in New Brunswick. And we know that all of you participating today live and work on many lands and territories of Indigenous peoples across Canada. And we encourage you to join us in reflecting on the value of their histories, languages, and culture. And to make that part of our work going forward. Je crois qu'on va présenter uniquement en anglais aujourd'hui, mais je vous encourage de participer dans la langue de votre choix. N'hésitez pas de poser des questions et on va partager des documents en français après la réunion aujourd'hui. I want to introduce my colleague, Chris Weep, who's here, a big player in the Heritage Reset project at the National Trust, and behind the scenes colleagues, Emily Boulet and Holly Boulet, who are here to deal with any technical issues. So moving right along, just a little bit about the National Trust. These gatherings are really part of our mandate to do work to strengthen the heritage movement. I'm happy to tell you more about our programs at the end of the session if we have time, and don't hesitate to check out our website. The Heritage Reset. So what is the Heritage Reset? I think it started as a simpler idea about sort of improving the brand of heritage, how heritage is seen in the world. And I think it's evolved as society has changed around us over the last couple of years during the course of the pandemic and important social movements. I think we're becoming increasingly aware that while heritage conservation has extraordinary potential for positive impact, it's also played a role in creating and perpetuating some of the problems that exist today. And there are also many barriers that we face that keep heritage places from playing their part in reconciliation, in climate action, in affordable housing, social justice, and other important social movements. And I think we're learning that those barriers are both inside the sector and also in the perception and the attitudes of a broader public. Sorry, I might just ask everyone to, if you're not presenting, just to put your speaker on mute. Thanks very much. So this project really has become about recognizing the urgent need to better align heritage conservation to be useful and meaningful to a broader public. And maybe, Holly, if you can just go to the next slide. So some of the challenges that we think this project needs to address. How can we better align heritage conservation to accommodate and to be meaningful to diverse communities, to the next generation, to those who've experienced barriers in accessing or safeguarding their own heritage? How can we accelerate the heritage movement's impact as a positive, essential, and progressive force for reconciliation, climate action, affordable housing, social justice, and more? So some of these questions on the screen. So I think the Heritage Reset is underway, as we heard at our conference, and as we see in examples like British Heritage BC's Setting the Bar, a guide to achieve new standards for reconciliation within the heritage sector, and the work that the Climate Heritage Network is doing to make that connection between heritage and climate action. But there's so much more to be done. And so this project is designed as a comprehensive approach to accelerate some of these really important conversations within the sector about our values and the purpose of our work. and to develop resources that will then equip practitioners to move forward together. And we know that similar work is actually happening in the museum sector in parallel. I think they're about a year ahead of us, and we're fortunate to have representatives from the museum sector's project here to speak with us a bit later in the course of this session. On the next slide, just to share the project partners that are already part of this initiative, and we really want many more partners to be part of this work. It really does need to be a sector-wide undertaking. So thanks so much to these organizations that have stepped forward. Some of them are actually helping to fund this work, and I invite any of you that are on the call today to raise your hands and to participate as part of this conversation. The inspiration for this work is an initiative that comes out of the craft sector in Canada, an initiative called the Citizens of Craft. And I think this initiative to really rebrand and reconceptualize the notion of craft and people doing craft in our country inspired both the work happening in the museum sector and in the heritage places sector. And I encourage you to go have a look at their website. When I first looked at it, I just thought, yeah, this is exactly what the heritage places world needs to really help us present what it is we're about and to come together around a set of really meaningful and compelling goals and values. So that's our inspiration. The opportunity that we now have in the heritage places sector is some substantial seed funding from the Government of Canada to fund what we've mapped out as I think a $430,000 project over 2 years. So it's pretty unusual to have this kind of funding available to us. And what's exciting is that this funding is allowing us to actually hire diversity advisors for the project. And we have two I think on the call with us today. Miranda Jimmy, who is a consultant in truth and reconciliation, Indigenous relations, and challenging colonial systems. And Karen Carter, who is the president of Karen Carter and Associates Cultural Consulting, who brings executive leadership experience in art, heritage, education, and community development. So I'm looking forward to hearing from them through the course of this project and welcome their interventions during the course of the call today if they'd like to weigh in. So that's the opportunity, and we have these great partners who are part of helping shape this work. Desired outcomes for this work, better insight for the sector, for all of us, about how our programs, tools, principles, messages, and the way that we operate resonates with a range of audiences. Secondly, a set of shared values that resonate within the sector, but also make sense for people outside the sector whom we need to engage with. There will be the development of data, stories that help us all make the case for heritage in a new way. We're calling it the new case for heritage. And new audiences reach through the course of this work. So on the next slide, I'll just quickly run you through the components of this project. So project one, we're actually coming toward the end of, and that was the summit held at our conference this past fall. And Chris Weeb will tell you more about that conference and what came out of it. So the summit and values development. We're just launching into the second project, which is the research phase, and we'll talk a bit more about the sector-wide survey consultation work and national public polling that's planned as part of that work. The third project, I just mentioned the new case for heritage, which includes research, collecting examples, collecting case studies, and culminating in a sort of boot camp that helps get this information about the new case for heritage out there across the sector. And the final piece is a public awareness campaign, a bilingual public awareness campaign that would be supported with videos, podcasts, web-based material, a social media campaign, a public advertising campaign, and that boot camp phase to help all of us, the sector, take advantage of this opportunity to really get the word out about the work that we do and the benefit that heritage can bring to important social goals. So that's a quick overview of the pieces of this project. And I think now might be a good moment to turn it over to our colleagues from the museum sector. And I'll ask Chris Weeb if you'd like to just say a few words to introduce our guests from that parallel universe.
Thanks so much, Natalie. Yes, coming to you from the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people here in Ottawa. And as Natalie was mentioning, there is a parallel kind of activity going on in the Canadian museum sector. I was hearing about activity in the library and archive sector too. So I think there's a lot of introspection and realignment going on in multiple cultural sectors. So we're not alone. And it's good to share our insights across these what are typically silos. So today we have with us, I'm excited to introduce Jennifer Forsyth from the who's the executive director and CEO of the Alberta Museums Association, and her colleague Caroline Lowen, who's the project lead of something called Reconsidering Museums. And Reconsidering Museums was launched in 2020 by a consortium of led by the Alberta Museums Association in concert with a consortium of provincial territorial museums associations and the Canadian Museum Association. And they've really been charging ahead with a number of initiatives to examine where museums are at, where the perceptions at, or public perceptions are around museums. And I'll let them unpack where they're at and where they're going themselves. But welcome, Jennifer and Caroline.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate that. My name is Jennifer Forsyth, and I'm the Executive Director and CEO for the Alberta Museums Association. I'm joining you today from our office located on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional meeting ground and home for many Indigenous people, including the Cree, Saulteaux, Niitsitapi, Blackfoot, Métis, and Nakota Sioux peoples. It is my pleasure that we are able to share with you the work that we have done to date on the Reconsidering Museums project. The need for this project arose out of the AMA's last strategic plan. It became evident that museums were in need of current data and language to better articulate their social value and champion that value to visitors, communities, donors, and elected officials. While this need came from our own membership, we saw an opportunity to work with museums and partners from across Canada. Thanks to funding from the Canadian Heritage, the AMA partnered with the Canadian Museums Association and provincial and territorial museums associations from coast to coast to embark on reconsidering museums across Canada. In 2020, we conducted public research that included an online survey, public opinion research, and focus groups. We engaged with 500,000 Canadians on what museums meant to them. Our project lead, Caroline, will share some of our findings and how that information is shaping this project now. Caroline?
Thanks, Jennifer. Hi, I'm Caroline Lowen, the project lead for Reconsidering Museums. I am joining you today from Calgary on Treaty 7 territory, home to the Blackfoot, Tsuut'ina, Stoney Nakoda, and Métis Nation Region 3, and I'm delighted to be here. So as Jennifer mentioned, Museums for Me ask Canadians about the role, value, and future of museums. Out of this research, 3 themes emerged, and I'm going to briefly take you through those 3 themes that are informing our next steps. The first theme is access. For this project, access means many things. It means the physical accessibility of the site, as well as decreasing financial and time barriers to visitation. But it also means that source communities have access to collections. It means that information and knowledge is shared in a way that is understandable, relevant, and engaging. It means that the museum is inclusive and a place where people see themselves reflected in exhibits, programming, and collections. Canadian museums are doing this well. 94% of survey respondents feel welcome in museums. 89% agree that the museum is a safe space. 76% think that museums give people a sense of belonging and membership in a community. 70% even think that museums can help you understand and positively address inclusion and accessibility. There are barriers though. Only 57% of panel respondents think museums tell stories that reflect their values and those of the community they live in. This becomes particularly relevant when trying to build new audiences. 52% think that museums need to better represent all Canadians. So while people feel welcome in museums, they don't always see themselves reflected in the stories they tell. The second theme that emerged is authority. People continue to trust museums and consider them a credible source of information. They look to museums to teach them about the world, objects, and the stories of their communities. Both survey and panel respondents cite preservation and learning as the key functions of museums. And despite acknowledging that museums don't always reflect today's world, 78% think that they still help them learn about it. At a time when confidence in public institutions is increasingly tenuous, museums continue to hold the trust of Canadians. That trust is a valuable asset, and in order to maintain it, we heard that museums need to continue to tell the truth about our shared history. This leads into the third theme. The third theme is activism. This one is more nuanced and complex, but nonetheless emerged as a prominent theme, particularly when talking about the future of museums. Museum and heritage workers know that museums are not neutral, and it seems that museum goers generally agree, although not everyone. When asked about current social issues, the top 3 issues that positively impacted how people see the role and value of museums were technological and digital innovation, Indigenous reconciliation, and racial injustice. The public sees museums having a role in addressing these issues. So when asked how museums can address these issues, education was on top, followed by better representation and advocating for social change. A small minority, 15%, think that museums are actually part of the problem. But significantly, only 6% thought that museums couldn't address societal issues. The question for the public is about how museums address them. The data also presented some competing priorities, specifically generational disagreement about the role of the museum here. We found that younger respondents, aged 18 to 34, are more likely to think that museums should actively advocate for social change, while older, 55+ respondents were more likely to think that museums should be neutral and apolitical. So what does this mean for museums and the heritage sector? Much like the National Trust Project, now that we've heard from Canadians, we're working to develop messaging and a rebrand that will resonate with both museum workers and the general public. That messaging will inform the creation of a communications and advocacy toolkit that we are currently piloting at 6 Alberta museums. The toolkit will include messaging that is informed by the data from Museums for Me, communications material, an advertising campaign, and advocacy tools to help support the sector communicate its social value to the public. In fall of 2022, the final version of the toolkit, alongside an interactive website, will be rolled out nationally. We'll be working with the pilot museums and our partners across the country listed here to train museums on how to best implement the toolkit and associated resources. So while we're piloting and working on the project out of Alberta, it's a national toolkit, and we're hoping that museums across the country can really buy into this and use it to reach their communities. So that's a real brief overview of what we've heard. And over the next coming months, you'll be hearing more about what's coming out of the project as we release some of the tools and resources. But if you have any questions about the project, the data that I've presented, or the forthcoming toolkit, feel free to reach out or ask questions in this session. I will bring us back.
Thanks so much, Caroline, for running through that. And I think there's so much to learn from that experience. And just hearing you talk about the looking to the museum sector for that kind of authoritative voice, or that kind of credible voice, and also that kind of activist stance. I think that's something that the heritage community needs to really look at in terms of how it carries that role forward as well. I also want to say that yes, the museum sector, there's a lot of overlap with the heritage places sector that we're a part of at the National Trust and other organizations. But we're actually looking at things more broadly, at heritage places more broadly, places like heritage sites open to the public, yes, and commercial sites open for commercial purposes, residential, Indigenous cultural landscapes, and some of the intangible values associated with those. So the museum sector has a strong vision for us to help guide us forward as well, and to see ourselves in concert with. So where did this with the Heritage Reset project? Where did it? Where have we come from? And I guess I wanted to just go over really quickly some of the things that we learned from one of the first phases of the project, which was at the conference 2021, which the National Trust and in concert with the Canadian Association of Heritage Professionals put on back in fall, and it happened virtually. A lot of you were there. It was interesting because a lot of that was our first kind of take at having a discussion with many people in the sector, and there were discussion groups built within the conference. There were insights extracted from the speakers and also from the question and answer and chat areas. So we had a large kind of whale going through and pulling out lots of different information. It fell down into 3 different streams or buckets. One was the environmental reset around positioning and thinking about heritage activity within that sphere. The other was the social cultural reset about expanding and changing our narratives and expanding and reasserting a certain kind of relevance. Then there was also the economic reset and looking at practice and planning and how they interface with transforming the kind of the marketplace for heritage places and how we're participating in those activities. So next slide, please. So what did we hear? Well, a lot of things, and you'll see here there were a lot of very good aspirational things identified there that people were saying that heritage places, the heritage places sector really cares about people and inclusion. It also really cares about stories and telling the whole truth. It cares about the planet and being involved in an instrumental way in the environmental sector. It's in the environmental kind of climate action movement. It also heard that we care about places of meaning, both physical and intangible, symbolic. But what we also heard was that while these aspirational goals are there, many of our partners afterwards and were questioning, whether we're actually aligned currently with those goals, whether our practices are actually living out those goals. And so together with our partners and others involved in this project, we really thought we needed to dig deeper on this whole area and look at it, work further on this kind of introspection and soul searching to see and honestly see where the sector is working and where it needs to advance. So some of the things, lingering perceptions that we identified at the conference and in the first phase, and that we need to confront are these kind of lingering ideas that heritage activity represents elites and in terms of what it cares about in terms of this kind of architectural connoisseurship that was part of the roots of the heritage conservation sector. Some of the others were the ideas that the full story is not being told through these places and that it's misrepresenting the past. The other is that heritage places don't have that much relevance when it comes to climate action. And that's something that we really need to work on. I don't think we're there yet. This perception that it's a cost versus an investment, that heritage is a nice luxury in comfortable times, but something that is not super useful in other times. And the fact that the broader purpose of heritage is not always clear to others when it comes to those other activities. So next slide, please. I guess the one question is, in talking with some of our consultants and others involved in the Reset project, is this idea of stepping back and thinking of heritage as a brand. And I know that some people may recoil from that whole kind of idea of jumping into that kind of marketing language, but I think it's really helpful, and I've come to see it as really helpful in terms of understanding how others see us and see the sector. We have a brand, we embody a brand, whether we like it or not, and we need to actively be participating in shaping it and resetting it. Next slide, please. It's interesting because Laurie Ferris, she's an architect out of the US, she had this quote about us being solutions people about rather than this larger perception that the heritage conservation movement is the culture of no, the Dr. No people. I think that comes out of an earlier kind of understanding of heritage conservation, where it's about protection and it's that posture. But it's really interesting. The other week I was talking with people in historic Scotland and also in Denmark, and they're really shifting to this whole idea of being people that are about solutions and about transformative adaptation. And of course, recognizing that protective role is still there, but really situating themselves in a different space. And so I think that whole idea of the sector thinking of itself as an enabler and changing that kind of perception around the no people culture idea that lingers is really important. I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Natalie Bull, who's going to take it from here in terms of recommended actions. Natalie?
Thank you, Chris. So Chris has been telling you some of the observations that you mentioned consultants. Part of the benefit of this funding that we've received for the project has been our ability to actually hire the marketing firm, the PR firm that worked with the craft sector. I mentioned earlier that Inspiring Citizens of Craft initiative. So we're working with those same consultants, and those of you who are at the conference met some of them and were part of sessions they facilitated. So they're coming to us with that experience of working with another sector, facing similar challenges and doing similar kinds of work. So their recommendations, coming out of the conference and hearing our conversations, is these 4 steps on the slide here. So to start by getting the sector aligned around a few clear brand values that establish what we're about as a sector, addressing the gaps between our values and our practices. So it's not about just, candy coating what we're about and using different language or a different brand, as Chris explained, but we really want to figure out what are the gaps, how do we address them, what tools do we need, what practice guidelines should we be developing or revising to help us move forward constructively. They talk about defining the narrative and writing the story, so expressing what we do in ways that really connect with new audiences. A communications plan and an overall rallying cry. So that speaks to the public awareness campaign that is sort of the culmination of this work that will allow us to engage many more people in bringing the solutions that Heritage has to offer to the world. So that's their advice to us. And so we're now at the point of kind of landing on these brand values. So on the next slide, the partners met after the conference and saw a first version of these brand values that the consultants heard and felt that they were hearing lots of consensus on in those discussions. Chris and I have made some adjustments to them, and they'll be going back to the partners at our meeting on March 7th. You're welcome to comment on them here, and the sector will also see these brand values and be given the opportunity. In fact, you have the responsibility to look at these and weigh in and be part of this conversation as we do this work to get the sector aligned around a few brand values that we all feel articulate the purpose of our work. So here they are on the screen. These things we value. So community resilience and cultural resurgence, telling full stories and whole truths, reusing and renewing historic places, and this idea of doing our work in a way that includes all people. So those are, we'll see those again. I think you'll see them again, certainly through the consultation phase. And then the consultants kind of map this out for us with, they call it the 4 corners of our brand heritage mandate. So in the 4 corners, people, places, stories, and planet. And then those values again that we just saw on the previous screen at the center of this work that we're doing. So again, this will all come out for feedback in the next phase with particular questions for the sector. So maybe we'll pause here for a moment and just ask if there are any questions about what the trusts, this project that the trust and its partners have mapped out to this point, anything you'd like to ask or weigh in on, and also on what you heard about the parallel work that the museum sector is doing. So you can use that reaction button to raise your hand, or you could put a comment in the chat. We're really open to your participation. I'm just going to look. I do see some questions maybe that came into the chat.
While you're doing that, Natalie, I would just say that this whole reset kind of idea is sort of a wave, a bit of kind of a tsunami washing through the preservation universe across the globe. I know that the Australia, they're working really hard on this. I just saw they had actually gotten, maybe it was Western Australia, got some legislation around climate action in linking that with heritage that came before Parliament there just recently too, just yesterday. I know that the Americans are doing a lot of work with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, is going through a similar kind of introspection activity, and it's happening in Europe too. So we're part of a larger groundswell.
Great. And some interesting comments in the chat from Jane about the word truth being problematic. So no, that's really good feedback. So I would say we really are at an early stage of kind of test driving these statements, these values, and everyone's input is definitely needed and valuable. So I hope we'll have a bit more time at the end, but maybe we'll just go ahead now while people are pondering this. And Chris, I might ask you to check in with what people are doing in the chat. So the next phase of the project is the research phase. And so I've mentioned a couple of times the idea of a sector survey. So the purpose of this phase is to really test those draft brand values, to capture our own view of the work that we do ourselves, going further than the conversations that happened at the conference. We want to use this phase to gather information about gaps, need for training. What are you finding challenging in your work, making the connection between your work and reconciliation, doing your work in a more inclusive way. What revised tools might you need? Do the tools that we currently have help us do this work effectively or appropriately? We would like to also use this phase to gather examples of what you see out there, people and places and projects that are illustrating these values in practice. As we said, we know that the reset it's underway. There's great work happening and interesting projects and ways of working that are inclusive and that are showing the connection between older buildings and climate change. So we want to capture those great examples with this work as well. And the survey, it's not going to be a survey monkey survey. We're working with the consulting firm to help design a process and a platform that does allow for focus group testing and for kind of back and forth and conversations within the sector. So it's not going to be a simple static classic survey. And so we're still working with them on mapping that out, and they'll be presenting their thoughts and recommendations to the partners at a meeting on March 7th. So that's the sector sort of consultation engagement phase. And then in parallel, the marketing firm will be working with us and the partners to put together some public polling. And so the purpose of that work, and I think hearing from the museum sector was interesting because you're hearing the kinds of input the museum sector got from public polling. So similarly, we'll be going out with a national public poll to capture perceptions about the sector, to explore our brand. What is our existing brand? How are we perceived out there? And ultimately to gather data that would shape the way that we approach a public awareness campaign in the culmination of this project. Some of you may recall that we, in a sort of pre-phase of this project, we did some public polling that focused more on Canadians and their attitudes to heritage places, which gave us some really interesting data. So we may drill down further in that area as well. So it won't be just about how the sector is perceived, but also more about how Canadians connect with heritage. So that's the research phase. And so that will be, you'll be seeing more on that before the end of March. So we're getting it organized. We can jump ahead maybe and sort of scroll through some of the possible questions that may be part of this sector consultation. So, for example, if we agree that one of those values that we share is reusing and renewing, how far can we go to accommodate the reuse of heritage buildings? How do we have the tools to help us make good decisions about performance upgrades or increased density in traditional areas? Some of these challenging areas that I think we struggle with as a sector. The fourth question there, do our practices and our standards get in the way of making building reuse viable? So some kind of tough love questions here for the sector. On the next, let's jump ahead to the next slide. So if we value telling full stories, what is our strategy to expand beyond the dominant narratives and stories and confront the full story? So I think we all say we want to do this, but what's our strategy? What's our framework? How are we going to make it happen? On the next slide, if we value community resilience and cultural resurgence, do heritage conservation tools and practices such as our statements of significance and our standards and guidelines actually do everything they can do to foster reconciliation, redress, and equity? And then an example of that fourth value, if we value including all people, I think that third question is interesting. How are we attracting people from underrepresented groups to our field to transform the heritage sector? So just some thoughts there. So those questions that we want to ask the sector are certainly open for input and feedback as well. And we'll be working through those with your input and with the partners over the coming weeks, with the goal of getting the survey out, as I said, before the end of March.
Natalie, just jumping in, I was just noticing a comment and some others in the chat from Eric Charon saying, will the reset also have a legislative angle to push for policies to protect heritage from an economic and environmental perspective? In Ontario right now, heritage acts and community advocacy are under attack in the name of providing more housing. I think this is a really interesting, opens up an interesting can of worms and can of questions. And I think maybe Caroline and Jennifer can jump in on this too. I'm just trying to think, like, how do we both examine? I think there's things coming at us from all sides right now as a sector, a heritage sector. We're being asked, or we're feeling the need to change from within in terms of advancing and changing our own practices, being more inclusive, working actively on reconciliation, etc. But we're also, some of the traditional ideas are being under the microscope and are being attacked. So how do you sort of justify, how do you balance the openness of acknowledging shortcomings and changing your practices while also trying to shore up the parts of the value that we've already established that have traditionally been there at the same time? It's a difficult time. Justifying yourself, but also critiquing yourself and changing yourself. It's a balancing act. I don't know if you have if you'd heard anything from the museum sector that could help illuminate some things for us.
Yeah, I think for us, we had seen some of these things as a need for a really long time. And what the research did was it gave us the tools to be able to talk about it in a way that people can start to use that when they talk about the work that they're doing. Because for so long, we've kind of fell back on, well, our communities don't want this, or our stakeholders are against this. But what the data actually says is that there is a groundswell of people who want to see our sector move forward. And I think it's a really big step forward for us to start to look at ourselves differently. I think it takes looking at our own organizations, how we're structured, how we can restructure to align with this work. So as we go through this, we're starting to look at how can we then fold all our work back into our organization and look at internal change that aligns with some of these values.
Interesting. I'm seeing some great questions and comments in the chat. How does one argue for preservation of a 19th century downtown when that is seen as environmentally irresponsible? And it's reminding me that way back when this project was not even a gleam in our eye, we were in sort of having a debrief about our failure to make hay with that private members bill proposing a heritage rehabilitation tax incentive, something that we think is one of the important tools needed in Canada's toolbox to encourage reuse of older buildings. And this project, this work actually came out of those discussions. We realized that until we had the ability to connect, to make the argument in a way that really is meaningful to the issues out there, to really connect with the broader public, that we will never get traction on some of those big public policy changes that we need. So in a way, it feels like this is a delay in tackling those issues. I think we actually want to do it in a way that it is empowering and enabling and allows us to make those bigger gains. So
Natalie, it looks like Karen Carter wants to jump in.
Karen, great to have you on the call. Karen is joining the project as a diversity advisor.
I would just quickly say that I think your outreach is connected to legislative impact, because if you broaden what is frankly seen outside as a pretty white and aging community, to get more young people, more diverse cultural associations, more broad representative, then you have the ability to impact legislation, because you build a bigger groundswell, which frankly, at the close of the day, as we know, politicians want to get reelected. And so if they see that their constituency in a fulsome way is able to, they hear those voices, it would have an impact. I mean, I know right now, I've been doing some volunteer work with the Zeidlers around Ontario Place, and that's one of the biggest issues is there's 300 people when they do a full community call for the advocacy they're doing around Ontario Place as significant heritage property with significant history globally as a modernist park. But when you're on that call, I can count the few young people or diverse faces. And so you see why it's not seen as important necessarily for the provincial politicians. So I think your ability to be successful is partly connected to how you outreach, and how that outreach, you almost have to be checking everything you do against what does the demographic look like, because you can do outreach and still end up with young, white, middle-class people and not hit diverse cultural representation. And then no matter what the data says, someone's going to poke at how skewed the data is because it isn't representative. So I think there's two challenges there, the broader outreach. And I know one of the things we found interesting at Museum when that was being built was it was a lot of work. It was a lot of follow-up. And so you understand why people don't willy-nilly do it, because I spent more time out of the office meeting with people than I did at my desk doing things. So the days became longer, and it was important to have a team that was comfortable with that outreach. But that's not something that, as a rule, we've been programmed in the sector to do. We usually do what we do, and it's a lot to do, as you mentioned, Chris. Like it's this internal look and balancing the internal with the external, and no one wants to go out to community and feel like you don't have a sense of who you are. But I think we'd be surprised at how people appreciate the honesty and the vulnerability, and it feels like you're then making space for them. You go out with too many answers, it feels like you've already decided what you want and you're coming to them for a specific thing. So I think we should embrace the risk because it is a risky venture, but I think people really appreciate that, because then it feels like, okay, there's actually, you haven't figured it all out and you're actually interested in what I think. And then you really will build a sense of community, which will shift. I think someone else was talking about the language like accuracy around storytelling instead of just diverse perspectives, because the other thing you'll find is even in those diverse cultural community associations, there's a very different lens, as mentioned, around what young people think and what their elders think. If you go to a Portuguese association or a Jamaican association, the elders in their 50s and 60s and 70s who built those things, they're having tensions with the young people. The Africa Center in Edmonton, it's a whole different paradigm for what the elders are thinking and what young people are thinking. So it also gives us a bit of an understanding of it's difficult within those community groups and how we might help them find a way within this broader piece. Because I feel like right now what's happening is there's a bunch of small community groups that are not actually affiliated with this machine. And the goal is to pull them in. But they're having their own challenges within their smaller cultural associations. Stuff to think about.
Thanks for that, Karen.
I'm just seeing Eric Hansen had an interesting observation from coming out of a Museums Association survey. About 15% of participants finding museums to be part of the problem, and saying, you know, that's kind of an alarming number. And I'm sure that the heritage sphere would see maybe even more elevated numbers in terms of part of the problem, in terms of addressing social redress and environmental issues and economic inequality. What did your team, Caroline, pull away from that kind of that number in your work?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because when you break the data down for age groups, that number rises to closer to 25% of people aged 25 to 44 think museums are part of the problem. And so I think, interestingly, though, the number of people, the percentage of people that think that museums are part of the problem and the percentage of people that think that they can't address these issues, it's almost none of the people that think museums are part of the problem think they can't address these issues. So they still have hope for museums, even if they think they're part of the problem. They still think that there's ways that they can address it. And the way that comes out more strongly amongst that group that thinks museums are part of the problem is that museums should play an active role in advocating for social change. The people who don't think museums are part of the problem think museums should remain neutral. So there's a divide there, and it's generational. So yes, museums are part of the problem, but there is hope in that they can advocate for social change. They just need to do something, and it needs to be active, is what we're hearing from the younger generation. So yes, that 15% or 25, when you break it down by demographics, is sort of frightening when you see it on the face of it. But to me, it's much more encouraging to see that number than to see the percentage of people who think that museums have no role to play. Because I think it just indicates that they still have hope for museums and for the sector, and think that there is still a role for them to play. So maybe frightening in that it's an encouragement for museums and the heritage sector to take a more active role, and that people are tired of us seeing us sort of sit back and just watch change happen around us.
And I also think it's really interesting, just coming back to what Karen was saying. Thanks for that, Caroline. What Karen was saying about vulnerability and about being that kind of honesty and transparency when communicating with the public. I think it's a real opportunity for expansion. That's a great insight in terms of in a time when there's questions arising around heritage conservation. Its utility, whether it's thwarting or enabling, it's easy to kind of go back into a defensive posture that kind of tries to justify the status quo. There's a lot of things that are valuable there, but also that kind of openness to change and to recognizing the biases that linger within there are really interesting. And I also think this whole idea around expanding the vision and taking the heritage vision of stewardship around heritage places really can be a powerful lens to look at all existing buildings, and in a society where things are tremendously out of balance. I mean, I was just seeing the numbers of demolitions coming out of Vancouver, where there's about 3,000 houses going into the landfill each year. That's just it might be one of the demolition capitals of North America. San Antonio, Texas, maybe I've bandied this around many times, 600 houses a year. I think, there's something out of balance, and I think the heritage vision can insert itself in those ways and expand how people see the heritage discussion. So anyway, really interesting.
So lots of great comments in the chat, but don't hesitate to raise your hand and just be part of the conversation. It's not by invitation only. seeing some really interesting comments about use of language, and that you know, the misunderstanding among the public and probably within the sector too, that heritage is not objects, but it's the process, heritage conservation as a process for valuing and finding futures for places. So lots of good thoughts here to shape the language. And really the consultants, the PR consultants are very interesting people who are bringing interesting perspectives to us, but we need to feed these ideas to them and help find a great and compelling way forward.
I'm seeing Peggy Sargent. Peggy, have you unmuted yourself intentionally out of Saskatoon there?
I have unmuted myself. Yes, I have.
Excellent.
Hi, everybody. Yes, I'm speaking here from Saskatoon, and I'm really interested in this really broad discussion that's going on, but I'm wondering how you intend to capture situations amongst small grassroots community associations, because that is where the issues rise. The relationship to climate change and also inclusiveness, all those things, you have to get really down to the grassroots level with the smaller community associations. It's all very well to talk to the Museums Association. It's all very well to talk to provincial associations, but in a country that is so spread out, and communication is actually really difficult, especially in Saskatchewan, where the population is just, I mean, you have 2 centers and everybody's all over the place. Very difficult to communicate in lots of ways. So I'm hoping that when you're doing the survey and the polling, that you reach the grassroots people, the grassroots organizations, because that's the face of heritage, if you like, for that community. And it's really important that we as a group, I say in Saskatoon, reflect some of your values, but sometimes that's really difficult. And just to let you know that the people down there at the bottom that work hard, and you really need to get to those people and see that relationship between smaller groups and the community. So it's something that we can put forward to our local authority, if you like, especially with regard to climate change, density, those sorts of things. Climate change and increased density, they work together. Economics, of course, and we're having real trouble in downtown Saskatoon right now.
Thanks, Peggy.
So it's those sorts of things. Okay,
yes.
So just get it right down to the bottom.
No, for sure. So Heritage in your province, Heritage Saskatchewan is one of the partner organizations, and they'll be helping get the word out. It's definitely not just speaking to the organizations. It's about individual practitioners, volunteers, heritage advocates. And the fact that you're on this call means we're reaching you. So we're optimistic that we've got a pretty good mailing list. But you feel free to help us get the word out to others. Mm-hmm. The goal is to have it be as inclusive of the sector as it can be.
Yeah, I'm sure it's just really difficult. Yeah.
So any other comments or questions, or Chris, anything you're seeing in the chat you'd like to bring to everyone's attention?
Kate Russell saying that grassroots is really important. and essentially get down. I think there's going to be lots of opportunities for participation in that survey and that kind of more participatory process that Natalie said is going to be unveiled soon, to challenge some of the things that came out and add to and revise some of the ideas that came out of the conference back last fall, and to really test those. So I think that's going to be a great opportunity for people like Peggy and Kate and others to involve the grassroots work communities as well. Sorry, I think Nora Reed has her hand up.
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so my question is, I mean, all this is wonderful, and you're coming out with, you know, some recommendations. National Trust is a national organization, and I'm just wondering, is this going to be going to the federal government, to the provinces? And I'm thinking specifically of the issue I brought up about mandates for intensification and the clash it has with the environmental mandate. And that's coming down for us from the province to the region, to the local community. And so when you make the case and you say, this is the whole character of this small city within 2 or 3 blocks, that you've designated a regional growth center, an intensification center, and you want, you know, high rises there, the answer is always, well, the region's mandating it, the province is mandating it. So I guess what I'm asking is, what's the plan for advocacy?
Good question. I mean, we're running out of time today, but I think as we expressed earlier, this work is intended to make us all much more powerful advocates. That it's about bringing the sector together around shared purpose and giving us better arguments that are more in line with what's important in society now, to help us be more effective in the work that we do. So I'm not sure if that's a great answer, but it really is about kind of bringing us together and doing this work to bring our approach to heritage conservation up to the 21st century, and to be more in line with these big shifts happening in society. So I think it will make us more powerful advocates. The public awareness campaign, Chris and I were talking earlier, like we can shift that in whatever direction we think it needs to take. It can be about heritage and climate change. We can use this opportunity that we have to make to create the impact that we agree we need to see. So this first step is to really get your comments and your questions, to gather them through this sector survey. And again, we'll, as a reminder, we'll be coming out, inviting everyone to be part of that and to participate in that process before the end of March. So I think we've got to wrap it up there today. Just want to thank our guests from the museum sector, Caroline and Jennifer, and my colleague Chris Wiebe, and all of you who participated. Thanks to the partner organizations who are involved in moving this work forward, and to our diversity advisors, Karen Carter and Miranda Jimmy. Karen, did you have something? Did you just put your hand up, or you're just?
I was just saying bye. And
hello, great.
Sorry.
So, and thanks to Holly and Emily in the background, making everything work with the technology. We'll share a recording of this session along with the record of the chat, because there's so much in there I certainly want to check in on. And again, just thanks so much. We'll be in touch. Merci beaucoup et à la prochaine.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Everyone, well done.